All right, everybody. Welcome to the Monday, November 21st meeting of SIG Service Catalog featuring my cat. And today we've got two main things on the agenda. The first is the demo of the code in the incubator repo that the Google folks contributed as we agreed in Seattle. And second is I wanted to discuss some things around project governance. So let's try to time box this demo at about 30 minutes. And that'll give us some time to talk about questions, next steps, and then project governance. So Vile, you're assigned to do the demo. You can have the floor now.
Are you doing this, Brendan?
This is Brendan, and
Okay.
I'm going to be doing the demo.
Got it. So for future reference, Brendan and Vile are fungible.
Yes. My last name contains his first name, so.
Perfect. All right. Take it away, Brendan.
All right, let me just figure out how to screen share here. Okay, I've got a super dumb slide deck that's really short, and hopefully we can keep it well under 30 minutes. Oops. Let's start at the beginning though. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in. I'm not sure if anybody is confused at all by this. I'm working under the assumption that the people listening have at least seen the PR at a high level. And I'm just going to jump into the components and the general architecture and conceptual model as it exists today. And then then I'll do a demo, and then I will do forward-looking action items for how this needs to change to come in alignment with what we were discussing in the face-to-faces. So at the top level of the code base now, we have three main components. We have the service controller, which is what we've been describing as the catalog. It's the thing that watches for Kubernetes resources and interacts with brokers and will eventually inject binding credential information into the Kubernetes native space. So that is part one. That's probably the biggest piece. Also part of this is a Helm-based white box broker. So what this is a service that runs in the cluster that implements the broker API that uses Helm charts for service instances and bindings. So you can implement service classes and install them into what we call the service registry. That is basically the dynamic catalog for this broker, and it will expose it through the catalog interface as normal. Third, we have the user-provided service instance broker, which we all talked about a bunch, maybe in our last face-to-face. This implements the Cloud Foundry user-provided service thingy, but it does so by exposing a normal service class through the normal broker interface. And so this is a separate broker that you can install into the cluster, and it exposes a single type called the user-provided service, and that will be demoed as part of this. Finally, we have the examples directory, which contains a bunch of Kubernetes spec files that do all sorts of different stuff. We're going to go through one specific subsection of the examples folder, which is the walkthrough, and that walks through a couple of different use cases. We're not going to do the full demo. I'll just do a small subset. So this is the architecture. It should look pretty familiar and similar to what we've been drawing on the board a bunch of times. You have Kubernetes objects, which today are implemented as third-party resources, but eventually we want to move to federated API. And we have these four objects. They're service broker, service class, service instance, service binding. We have the controller running in the cluster, which is watching these, and does it do any modification for status? I think it does not. So right now it's just watching them. It's really just a read, but it's also set up to, eventually post state back when we have that. And then on the flip side, you're adding brokers. Every time you add a broker, it populates all of the classes that broker exposes through its catalog as we would all expect. Okay, so the current consumption model, this is where we've diverged pretty significantly from what we've been talking about in the SIG, but it's done in such a way that it's really easy to migrate over to the new model. As we were building this thing, the consumer side was service instances, so you would be binding service instances to service instances. This is really just a function in the cloud, in the service controller that we could swap out to say, create these native Kubernetes resources instead of injecting binding information into a consuming service instance. But I just wanted to put this up there because this is the model as it exists in the demo I'm going to be showing off, and so there might be some oddities in the demo for consuming bindings that you wouldn't normally have in the native consumption model. Okay, cool. So, so what I'm going to show off is I'm not going to show off custom service instances consuming bindings because we don't care about that in this context. So I'm going to show off a native Kubernetes application consuming a binding to a user-provided service instance because I think that hits all of the different components of the service. So right now we have all of these things running. What we care about is the controller, the Kates broker, and the UPS broker. These are the three major components. Also, the registry is the service registry. That's the dynamic catalog backing for the Kates broker. Everything else, this is set up from some internal stuff, so there's some extra junk in here, including this namespace Plory, which is kind of our internal name for what we've been working on. I believe the namespace is actually catalog in the code that we've open sourced. So we can start out by looking at what service classes we have, and we have none because we have no brokers. So we need to install some brokers. So we have this spec file that contains the two brokers we care about. And you'll see here we have one named Kates and one named UPS, and they both point to the respective brokers running in the cluster. And so if we just kubectl create -f broker, we have these created. And if we look at the classes, there should be a bunch of classes exposed. So these top three were exposed from the Kates broker. Those are classes that we created that are backed by Helm charts. And then this user-provided service is the custom class that's exposed by the UPS broker. So let's see, let's hope that I have the appropriate stuff set up for the demo because I was tinkering with it earlier. Okay, so I have this random service running in the cluster called Bookstore. Let's assume that that's something that I manage separately from the catalog system, but I want to consume it through the binding mechanism. So let's treat that as a user-provided service. So I need to create a service instance that points to it of type user-provided service. And I have Foresight, so I did that already before the demo. So this is the spec file for creating that user-provided service instance. You can see that the kind is service instance. We're going to name it backend, and the service class is user-provided service. And then I have specified as input parameters the set of credentials that are to be returned when I bind to it. And for host name, because it's inside the cluster, I can just use the Kubernetes service name. So let's create that. And you'll see that I have this service instance now. Great, grand, wonderful. I can now create a binding to it and consume that binding from a native Kubernetes application. So let's look at the binding. So peeking under the covers at the brokenness of this demo, because we have that conceptual model of service instances binding to service instances, this binding has a from field. and I will need to create another service instance that it injects the binding information into the cluster for us. But that's all because of the existing conceptual model. The magical bits here are the kind is service binding, the name is bookstore database, and we're binding to that service instance that we just created called backend. So let's create that. So we now have a binding. Were this in the conceptual model that we've all been discussing and agreeing on, the config maps and secrets and services and whatnot would be created already on our behalf. In this current thing, I'm going to have to create a binding consumer that is going to create those resources for me. So this is just a special class I have that's a Helm chart that creates basically config objects in the cluster. So
it's kind of service instance. That throws me a little.
I'm sorry?
The kind is a service instance. That seems a little odd.
In what sense? Can you clarify that a little bit?
I don't know. I just would have expected you to be creating a secret or something, not necessarily a service instance.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So going back to what I described earlier, let's go back to this.
Oh, you're creating. Oh, I'm sorry. You're creating the guy you're binding between. Is that right?
I'm creating the consumer side.
Got it. Okay.
Which in this model is a service instance, and we'll create that secret and config map on our behalf.
Okay, got it. Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem. So that created a config map, I believe, called bookstore Node.js, and we can see that here. And if we go and look at it, that has all of the necessary things. We just created a config map because that's the easiest way to demonstrate. But as we've described before, that would really be a secret and a config map and a service. Now that we have that, we can spin up a native application, and we don't have to go through this whole spec file, but you can see here down at the bottom that we have environment variables. It's not auto-injecting right now because we don't have a concept of a SIP, but you can see that somebody could use this in a native manner by just doing a config map ref or a secret ref. So if we do that, if we create that, we now have that new service, and it's probably going to take a minute for the external IP to come up, so we won't actually ping it to test, but we can always come back to it if that's important to people. So what that just described was creating a service instance. In this case, we created a user-provided service instance, but it could have been a black box instance of some other kind that took input parameters. In this case, it took the credentials because that's what a user-provided service instance takes. And then we bound to it, and that binding allows us to inject the credentials into the cluster. That last mile bit is work that needs to be done, but it should be very simple plug and play into the code base. So the next steps of the work items in this code are aligning the object model. So we, the macrocosmic object model is pretty much aligned. It's those four objects. They have various inputs, but the microcosmic alignment is probably not there in terms of what the particular fields are, what their names are, having the status fields or the condition fields or whatever they are. All that stuff needs to be aligned, and it might be just as simple as rebasing the code to use the new objects that I think we all wrote down and checked in during the face-to-face. The next step is cutting out the function that does the service instance to service instance binding and replacing it with code that generates the native Kubernetes resources to inject the binding information. Completing the broker interface. So in this code, we implemented most of the broker interaction, but There's some stuff missing, namely around async operation stuff. The brokers we checked in are synchronous. They're going to return when they're actually done. And because of that, the current service controller does not do operation polling and whatnot. But I think the object models have operations in them. They're just not used. It's just done when the broker returns. As we're looking through the code, I think we have a list of a bunch of things, but I hope that other people, as they're looking through the code, are finding lots of issues and are capturing them as GitHub issues. I know there's a bunch of rough edges and incompleteness. There's probably a lot of naming stuff that needs to be done as well. And then probably the biggest work item is fleshing out testing for the different components.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Finish, Brendan.
No, that's the end of my slide deck in the presentation, so I was going to open it up for discussion / questions.
Okay, so let's do this in 2 steps, since we are going to talk about project governance next on the agenda. Let's have a period where we just have questions that pertain to the demo that's shown here. Doug, I see that you have one in the chat. The question is, can you elaborate on the registry thing?
Sure. So that's specifically a component of. Well, I don't have a good slide here, but that's specifically a component of the Helm-based broker. So it's the white box broker. So typically brokers have a pretty static catalog because the broker's written in code and it's hard coded that it serves these 3 types or 1 type or whatever. So how we chose to build the Helm-based broker is that as you're you should be able to dynamically add new classes, right? As you're creating new services, as you're creating new versions of services, you're probably going to be coming out with new classes to instantiate those. And so you don't want to release those as hard-coded things in the broker. It might be nice to have a dynamic catalog backing that broker. And so this is really just, it's separated out into a separate service, but it could just be an API on the broker itself for managing classes. And it's really just a RESTful API, a CRUD HTTP endpoint for classes on the broker.
Okay, so it's a thing specific to one particular broker then, right?
Yeah, it's not an addition or a component of the controller or the catalog. It's just this particular broker, it's allowing it to have a dynamic catalog.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, you're welcome.
I see another question from Aaron in the chat, which is, does the controller have a reconcile phase? I'm guessing that's like, the question is, are you simply watching events from the Kubernetes API server, or is there a periodic sync loop that goes through and looks at the total actual or desired state of the world and makes sure that the actual state matches it?
Right now, it's I'm getting a 50-50 signal from Ville. I think that it's mostly watch-based, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Ville, when it starts up, it reconciles. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, and then
you're muted.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it's definitely watch-based, and the reconciler is definitely not fully implemented, but every now and then when the watch craps out, it'll basically do a list of the world and reconcile sort of kind of like this.
Brendan, you are still sharing your screen.
Oh, cool. Done.
Okay, so are there any other questions about the demo that we've seen here, knowing as we've already, as Brendan already explicitly said, that there's obviously like a pretty high edit distance between what we agreed to eventually converge upon and the seed code that has gone into the incubator repo? Questions about the demo?
I have a question. So if I have a Cloud Foundry service broker and I wanted to tie it into the system, it seems like I would launch up that service broker somewhere, and then the connection point is just like a manual host port connection through the user provided service broker. Is that correct?
No, you can plug the broker directly into the service controller.
And so what would that look like?
So let me just reshare my screen so I can go back to this. You're still muted. Billy is talking away with some pretty profound stuff here, but I think we've missed it forever. Okay, so just going back, I maybe did this a little too quickly. So when we started out, we had no service classes, no brokers attached to the controller. I then did a kube control create on this spec file. And so this is telling these are two objects of kind service broker. And that is how you add service brokers to the catalog. So when the catalog sees one of these things, it's going to quote unquote attach it, and what it does is goes off and gets that broker's catalog and then assimilates it into the aggregate catalog that it exposes to the world.
So this is essentially the same flow that we talked about, where to indicate your intent to use a broker, you add a broker resource.
Yes.
Right.
So your cluster will have a set of brokers as Kubernetes objects that you can manage, and that I think we said the catalog operator is probably going to own this set of resources. And these, of course, will include username, password, or whatever else is necessary for connecting to the broker. In this case, we just left them open for the demo.
Does that make sense, Seth?
Awesome.
Okay, so if there are no more questions on the demo, I think we have kind of two matters that we can address here. The first is, well, one of them is, what are the things that need to happen to mutate this seed code into something that we feel we can tell people to use that is probably an alpha level initially. And then the second is, how do we do those things in a way that is collaborative, and what are the right kind of SOPs for governance vis-a-vis pull requests? I think that it's probably best to talk about the second one that I named first, and establish some like minimal ground rules that we can have to inform the second discussion. And since these are two pretty big topics, I think we can time box each of them at 15 minutes max. So it's about 4:30 now. Let's give it till 4:45, and we can just establish some, or attempt to establish some ground rules. Since I have the bully pulpit, I will go first and say that I think I have a couple ideas I want to share. The first is that developers tend to be very opinionated about the development experience of a project, and this is not at all a commentary on any personality in this group, but I've seen in my personal history developers frequently get distracted by matters like this. So the first thing I would propose is that we all keep the end goal in mind here, that we all have probably different styles for the type of development experience that we like, and that in matters where there is some contention about a specific thing, I think that everybody here is mature enough to resolve those things amongst themselves in an expedient way, keeping the end goal in mind. And I would also propose that if there is a really passionate disagreement that cannot be resolved, that I will engage the dictator hammer and make a completely arbitrary decision based on my personal tastes, which may be a coin flip at random.org, just to keep things moving in the right direction. And before I say any more, I wonder what folks' thoughts about that are.
I'm sorry, I don't really understand the specific question. Can you clarify that?
Okay, let me restate first. And here's where I wish we had a floor-to-ceiling whiteboard. Do we all agree that the specifics about the development tooling and any subjective developer taste-related matters are secondary to actually making the primary goal, which is to realize service catalog in Kubernetes happen? Does anybody disagree with that?
I'd say until we have something working, I agree with you. But after that, we should reevaluate.
Okay, so I also would say that that we all should agree that we will work together to smooth out any disagreements that might arise in an expedient way and not get hung up on it. Again, this is not any kind of commentary on personality. Personality is involved here. It's mostly coming from my personal history of years of being an engineer and engineering lead, that I've seen developers get very distracted over things that are not material to the end goal of their project. That's all. Does anybody not understand what I'm saying? Okay. So third thing is, I do want to suggest that we should follow the code structure and packaging conventions that are in Kubernetes master. I think it would be an awesome goal, since we I think it's reasonable to expect long term that we'll have a lot of folks that are familiar with Kubernetes master. So the Kubernetes repo want to come and check this out. I think that since this is also a Kubernetes incubator repo, that we should try to keep the conventions of development and the code structure consistent with Kubernetes itself. And that in matters of subjective disagreement, that goal should inform how we resolve it. Does that make sense to folks? I see a +1 from Gabe, and I hear no disagreement. I see another +1 from Doug, from Dan Wilson. Okay, I'm going to call that one adopted. So those are the easy ones, right? We know we're going to work together. We know that that we're going to try to make this look like Kubernetes, which also dovetails with the design goals that we've had. I think that there are some other less obvious things to talk about with project governance. So I would like to open the floor to folks that would like to bring something up, since I've been talking for quite a while. Doug, I have to disagree with you. Pink Mohawk is not for the faint of heart. It should be totally optional. Okay, so I don't see anybody super eager to speak, so I'll just go ahead and kick it off. One thing that was brought up is in the Slack channel over the last week is, what should the process be for establishing whether a change is ready to be merged? I will call out what has also been discussed in the Slack channel, that the code drop was merged without any review, and I think in that case, that's totally fine. We had previously agreed in Seattle that this would seed the incubator repo. And I don't think anybody has expectations that any part of this code is set in stone. We've just gone over that there's a fairly high edit distance between what is in there now and what we would like to ship. So there should not be any unnecessary attachments to that. I do think that it would be great now that we are entering a phase of the SIG where we expect to be having like fairly active development in the incubator repo, if we could establish a convention for when something is mergeable. And since I don't want to put my finger on the scale, I wonder if anybody in the group has opinions that we can use to jumpstart the discussion around what that might be, keeping in mind we have about 9 minutes left dedicated to this topic.
So Doug, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, you made a proposal on the other, maybe a month or two ago, on some of the other things we were working together, and I thought that had some pretty good thoughts on it. So do you want to talk about it or not?
Yeah, that's fine. I was trying to remember. I think there are two things at play there. One was make sure you get at least enough LGTMs, and then there was also the notion of making sure that things aren't necessarily rushed through. And so I think one half of it was pick how many LGTMs you want, say 3, as is pasted in the chat here. And then another side of it is to make sure that a proposal sits there for at least X number of days in advance, and at the same time, anybody can veto it. That way, people don't feel like they have to rush things. They have to approve it within a day or so. So it should give them at least a couple of days to review it and then stuff like that. But at the same time, if anybody has a veto power, that means it's obviously not consensus-based, and we need to go back and review it and discuss it.
And we also should make sure that there are no PRs that continuously lavish there and are not addressed. That was another side of the token, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
that's something that we have already in the for Kubernetes. I think that long term, there will be some kind of easy way to engage those bots and get that same kind of functionality. But I agree with you, Vile. For now, I think we'll probably have to establish a convention that your PR has a TTL. If it's not merged or not actioned on, if it gets stale, it should just be closed to avoid accumulating stale PRs.
So if we want to have some sort of a policy that prevents things from getting stale and some sort of a minimum LTTM, maybe you can combine the two and just say if there's no veto within a week or some period of time, then it's approved.
I think that runs against the minimum LGTM requirement, doesn't it?
I agree. I just don't know what the minimum should be. So
I agree with the minimum, but the maximum is problematic for reasons already explained. So it might be a good idea to have a PR review as part of the weekly SIG meeting.
Yes, I think that is good. So, Aaron, since that is a very specific, actionable suggestion, will you be the scribe and record these things into the notes?
Yes. Can someone paste the notes URL again?
I am on it.
Thanks.
Okay. I think that Doug's proposal is a fine starting point. 3 LGTMs is approved. Note your disagreement within 4 days. And we can totally refine that. Does anybody object to just, for the sake of expediency, using that to start with? And if we run into problems around that, we can reassess.
I worry about velocity of this model. I mean, I definitely agree in principle that multiple reviews are good, but I worry that particularly with dependent changes, we may be looking at a huge time lag. For example, just to give an example, we have 15, I would say, PRs ready to go on top of the code that we dropped in. And if each of them takes 4 days, we're looking at a month and a half before we get to the last one. And they're all essential, like lint cleanups, removing some dead code, this sort of stuff. And I worry that we will give up velocity at early stage of the project and treat it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I don't know, go ahead. Yeah, that was done.
How about we call it one day? This is a very small repository right now, and I am personally trying to allocate the majority of my attention on this repository. So if we feel as a group that we all want to be heavily involved, then perhaps we can expect that changes get reviewed within 24 business hours or 24 hours within the business week.
Yeah, business week would be good.
That would seem reasonable, yeah.
Okay. All right, hold on. I have to let this cat out because she's pawing like crazy. I think that's a good start. All right. So I think we have 1 day to note veto, 3 LGTMs required.
Can I ask a question, like LGTM from anybody or from the committers that are on the repo? Like what's the role of contributor versus committer?
So LGTM from a committer, I think, and I do have a to-do to add some of the Deus folks as committers. We have currently, it should be Brendan, Vile, Doug, Morgan, and myself are in committers. And yes, Aaron, I think committers have veto power. And I am going to add Aaron and Kent as committers unless there are objections, because the Deus folks have made some fantastic contributions to the
Could we clarify what the veto power means? Like unqualified, this is not going in, or over my dead body, or is it like I've got some concerns that need to be addressed?
So I would characterize veto power as if someone says they would like to veto approval, then I expect that person to say specific points that they disagree with, and we can have additional discussion, perhaps agree upon some follow-up changes. Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
I-845-548.
Yeah.
So my overriding feeling that I want to communicate on this recording is that I have a high degree of respect and trust for everybody that's involved in this effort, and I think that we should. I sincerely doubt we will get into a situation where where we cannot like resolve these things without going to the rule book. So I think we're all mature people. I doubt there will be a problem, but it's also good to clearly communicate expectations.
Just change my password, please.
So Brian, that's a great comment you've put into the chat. Would you like to say a few words about that on audio?
Sure. I was just going to say that I recommend reserving the heavier weight policies about getting 3 days or 3 LGTMs or whatever for major changes like API and architectural changes. and allow mere implementation changes to go in with single LGTM and passing tests. Something like that, much like we do in other repos.
Yeah, I think
especially the major repo, because I think that's where you really want the input from more people. Is for those more major changes that are going to be more impactful to everyone else working on the effort.
I think that's a really good point. So as an example, Golang cleanup should not require the full Monty of quorum.
My only concern with that is, given we've reduced the clock down to 1 day, which is not terribly long, given we're all really busy with other things. I'm a little unsure of how we actually draw that line, and people will draw the line in different places. And I would much prefer a consistent policy, given we're only talking about 1 day.
Okay, so I think we can change the window a little bit to address that. How about for things that are lightweight changes that are like not especially material, or let me put it this way, say for API changes and architecture changes that we extend the window to 2 days. And for lighter weight changes, I think that we can, for something like a lint cleanup, maybe a single LGTM, and as Brian said, passing tests are probably sufficient. I think if there's any question, then you escalate to the more formal process.
Will we have labels set up that delineate API architecture versus implementation versus administrivia, so on?
No, we don't. I can take a to-do to set those up in the repo.
Would it be horrible if we started with just a single process and then wait until we had a problem that caused us to add more bureaucracy? I just get very nervous about this idea of trying to delineate or get everybody on the same page in terms of what's minor versus what's bigger. And I don't want to get into those discussions. I'd rather just say, here's our process.
So I would prefer to start with something lighter weight, since I don't expect that we'll have a lot of architecture changes at first, and go to something more formal once we're talking architecture changes. And informing my position on this is that I expect that probably the largest architecture change is transitioning to like first class API and an API server from TPR. So I tell you what, does it, Doug? I hear your concerns. I'd like to get some other viewpoints, and I'd like it to happen in the next like 2 minutes because we're rapidly running out of time.
So my view is that following what I've seen in the Go project very roughly, there's a design doc process where design doc is required, not necessarily inside of a PR, but could be a Google Doc. The design doc is then discussed. In our case, it would be discussed in a SIG meeting. After the design doc is ratified, it goes into, it basically is just linked from the repo. And once that goes in, then it just becomes an implementation PR, which then can just be a 1 LGTM, 1 day minimum PR. So in reality, in that case, the reality would become there is no such thing as a API changing PR because you have already gone through the design doc process.
So this is very similar to what we do in Kubernetes, where the API changes typically have a proposal associated with them that is reviewed and merged before implementation begins. I tell you what, I have an idea for a compromise that can get us over this hump so we can talk next steps. Why don't we say this? I don't think that we expect any API changes Don't think we expect any API changes currently. We probably have many small cleanups and subtractions to do. So I tell you what, why don't we call it what's in the doc for now, and we can reassess at a later date, but we are out of time to spend on this for now. And we can, I think, trust that there aren't going to be any enormous architecture changes over the Thanksgiving week. Can we call it decided at this moment?
Yes. Yes. And I think it's also easy to add process later on to address shortcomings. I think it's more difficult to go ahead and spend a ton of time right up front when there's going to be corner cases and everything else. And I think we are mostly, sometimes myself included, adults here, so we can go ahead and self-police for the time being.
Yeah, I agree. I think you've captured it very well. I'm not hearing any disagreement. I'm going to call this agreed to, and with the caveat that we will definitely readdress in the future as we begin to build development momentum. So closing that topic out, let's revisit the code that was demoed. I'll kick off the conversation by saying that probably the biggest dimension that is different in this demo from what we agreed about or what we agreed to in face-to-face meetings is the lack of the binding resource. Brendan, you already brought that up. This is a larger than 10-minute discussion, but I wonder if we can talk about that initially, because I think it would be best to kind of stage this in terms of let's try to get the TPR-based APR close to what we agreed to, with the caveat that it is impossible to implement with TPR, as far as I understand, all of the semantics in the API that we need to correctly implement it. But let's get the nouns close to what was agreed to, and at the same time, orthogonal from that, we can be talking about the design of the first-class API as next steps. Anybody have thoughts on that?
Paul, just to clarify, we do have the concept of binding. I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. Did I choose the wrong word? I think perhaps Brennan, you already said something that seems close to what I meant.
Okay.
You know what I'm talking about?
No, because what you said was that there's not a concept of service bindings in the model. So maybe
okay.
Do you mean the service
the first slide that you showed with the 4 blocks and 3 arrows between them that you said was different from what we agreed to? What did you mean?
Yes, sorry. So it is different, but but all of the object models are there. So there is a concept of a service binding that you create as a Kubernetes object.
Okay, what are the differences then? Maybe this is lost on my feeble brain.
It's purely that right now the service controller has a block of code that says, I now have a binding that has credential information. What do I do with that credential information? And what it does right now is calls a function that does an update on the consuming service instance. And that needs to be replaced with a function that creates a secret and a config map and a service in the cluster.
Okay.
Everything else is
that's
there.
That's what I was referring to.
Yeah, okay.
So does anybody disagree that it would be a good next step to realize that change, to bring this further into alignment with what we agreed to in face-to-face?
I think that, this is Brendan again, I think that that change is important, and equally important is rebasing the code to the object model that we constructed during the face-to-face. So switching from versions of service instances and service bindings and brokers that we checked in as part of this PR to the ones that have been previously checked in and agreed on by everybody.
Okay, so I agree with you with the caveat that we're going to eventually approach the limit of what is possible to do without making an API server. Since this is a short week, I'm not really expecting a lot of changes this week. In fact, for all I know, the folks that are working on this now, you all could be taking the rest of the week off. I do think that there is additional discussion that needs to happen on the API types before we are able to start adapting into them, and we also needed an API server for them to live in. This is something I'd really like to discuss next week, just because we're out of time for now, pretty much. But if we could highlight one actionable change that could be made, I know that it's been brought up that there are some deletions to be made. I love code deletes. If you have code delete PRs, please bring them, and we'll pare this thing down before we make it any bigger. And this is my suggestion. I suggest code deletions, awesome, do them. I suggest if there's any actionable change that it should be the behavioral change of making the secret and service that Brendan hit upon now. Any objections there?
I absolutely agree.
Yeah, true that.
One comment, I don't know if it was discussed before, but it's one common workaround with third-party resource that may help us get a little farther is to actually create separate resources for spec and status. So that you don't have, if you actually need to report back status, you don't clobber the spec provided by the client. I don't know if we run into that problem, but if we have, that's sort of the typical workaround.
So for the
I'm not sure whether I'm not sure yet whether I personally think that it will be enough that it will be economical to do that change rather than just going to a full API server, but it's certainly something that we can talk about. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, if you do try API Server Federation and run into issues, please do let API Machinery know what those issues are so we can prioritize fixing them.
Yeah.
So one request I have is two things. Okay, one of them is pointers to the conditions and things like that in one of the document, aka so when we come in on Monday, it's not the nobody knows what we are talking about. And the second one is any kind of example pointers, the API servers for the federated API servers that we could have as homework to do for next Monday.
Okay, I can provide of that. I did open a pull request to the incubator repo to refactor the status into conditions.
Conditions, okay, great. Okay,
so we can begin reviewing that together.
Super duper.
Okay, so we're basically out of time here. I think we can continue any discussions on Slack unless there's something that anybody is dying to voice. You got about 30 seconds.
I want to figure out a best way to help everybody building the code because some folks have had issues, and because I built the make files, I cannot for the life of me reproduce any of them. So I want to find a way to help you guys, but me trying locally is not it because I always succeed.
Try putting your source in a directory that does not match a valid Go path.
Like contrary to the Go development style, however.
That is true. So what I personally do for that is I clone projects into my Go path and I make symlinks into them from the directory where all of my projects, Go, Java, whatever, go.
That's exactly what I did, and that's where I ran into trouble because it picked up the symlink name as opposed to the real Go path name, and then it got all funky and messed up.
Okay, I didn't run into trouble doing that.
Really?
So,
interesting.
Doug, you might be symlinking backwards.
okay.
It's always possible, yes.
Yeah, it might be you need, whichever way you're symlinking, you need to symlink the reverse. It could be. Does that make sense?
All right.
We are getting
Folks,
kicked out.
we're at
So.
time now. I'm going to end the recording to keep it manageable, and we can continue this discussion on Slack.
Very good. Thanks all.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.